in front of this audience, and a good fraction of the audience here, and most of the speakers in this session is with the land change lab group at Stanford from a few years ago, where we're discussing all these issues in there. So I'm not sure I will be able to tell you something you didn't know, but let's try. Leakage. Well, actually, there's a physical law about leakage, and physicists seem to have a law about most of the things that happen in the world, and this is known as the Bosch's law, that says that as you decrease the volume of a gas, the pressure increase, provided the temperature remains constant. But that's really the basic intuition in leakage, that when you constrain a system, somehow the system tries to find escape routes and to find some equilibrium. And we find something equivalent in social science. For instance, in demography, there's a concept of migration equilibrium that says that migration continues until change in locations no longer yield an increase in the utility of individuals, which also suggests this intuition of the systems always search from some equilibrium. And of course, in social science, we not only have the push factor, as we had in the Boyle's law, but we also have some pull factors. People are able to make decisions on conditions at place that they don't occupy already. They just make calculation of what will be my utility if I migrate versus not migrate. In economics, I think a kind of precursor to the concept of leakage is this pollution haven hypothesis that says that polluting industries will relocate to jurisdictions with less stringent regulations. And in fact, there's not a very strong empirical support for this hypothesis. There's some, mostly when we look at panel analysis. But again, there's the question of the pull and push factors. Of course, we can say that a very stringent regulation on pollution will push companies out of that place. But of course, any relocation decision is also based on the attractiveness of other places in terms of cost of labor, access to resource, and the other factors. There will be, if your new place where you relocate has a very poor governance on pollution, it's very likely that it will also have a very poor governance on many other things, which will impose a high cost on the company. So the cost of relocation is also an important factor. Leakage, I think the first time the concept was used as such is in the context of the carbon regulation, and it was noted that countries who adopt some carbon abating policies to reduce their emissions then at the same time to increase their imports from countries who did not adopt emission abating policies. And of course, EU is a beautiful example. The emissions in Europe have stabilized CO2 emission, but of course the imports of goods from China have increased dramatically. And in land use, I think we tend to rather talk about land use displacement, land use in one place that's caused by consumption from another place, which really basically is just trade. That's what economists have called trade for centuries. And there's this notion that was first in the carbon literature, but also in the land use. There's a difference between the strong leakage and the weak leakage. A strong leakage is when the relocation decision is really mostly explained by the policy at the place of origin. And that's real leakage. You just escape a stringent policy. But then they came up with this concept of weak leakage, which is also known as kind of demand-driven displacement. And there your relocation decision is mostly associated with this macroeconomic factor that Tom mentioned this morning, increase in population, increase in consumption, that's economic growth, which in that case, again, it's not leakage. It's just you increase a sector in one place because you have a series of macroeconomic factors that create an incentive to grow that sector. And just to finish with the terminology, more in the business world, I think they talk about offshoring, where you relocate your work in a different country, so there's a clear sense of geography. which is very different from outsourcing, and often there's a confusion between the two. Outsourcing is that you contract your work to another organization. There's no sense of geography in the outsourcing. There's a sense of different geography in the term offshoring. So you see all these different disciplines that basically talk about the same thing, but using very different terminologies. So in short, leakage is kind of in land use is a geographic redistribution of land use in a context where there's a very strong connectivity between places, such that the friction for capital, labor, mobility is very low. But again, if I stop there, this is just trade. There's nothing special here. But then what's really in the concept of leakage is that we attribute this redistribution to some policy intervention at the place of origin. And so we just assume we're just trying to move out of this regulated environment. And this is a very strong postulate that you can allocate a movement to a policy rather than to all these other macroeconomic factors that also happen at the same time. And again, I think that's the message we heard from the economist this morning. And also, leakage is really basically a system boundary issue. We call it leakage because we had defined a system as a province or a village or a country, and there are some spillover outside the boundaries of that system, and that's why we call it leakage. But if we had studied a much larger areas, we would never call it leakage. We would just have called it, kind of sectoral reorganization of the economy or something like that. It's just because we tend to define rather narrow geographic boundaries to what we study that we can say, okay, there's some effect outside that system. I think the initial research on leakage was really based on, at the local scale, on this area-based intervention, typically a protected area. So you just design a protected area. You say, okay, now we'll just protect this forest here. And so some people who were using that forest now just move at the margin, just at the boundary of that forest, and there's a kind of local scale leakage. You just shift things a little bit outside the protected area. And of course, we all know there's a selection bias. We did put that protected area at that place because probably the likelihood of that place to be deforested is lower. So there's some selection bias. We'll select mostly remote, high elevation areas to put a protected area. So rather than having a flat curve, we will have this line. But still, the concept that you just shift some actors from here to there, that's the kind of initial view of local leakage. And most of the initial studies were really trying to measure that. But then it moved to a verification of activities between countries, between regions, but also it could be between actors. You regulate large holders, and then they stop using some land, but then small holders come and occupy that space. So it's a leakage across a group of actors. Or it could be between land users. You have a soy moratorium. Then you stop doing soy there, but then cattle comes or some other crops. It's a different form of leakage. Between sectors, you regulate forestry or maybe agriculture, then there's some forestry impact of mining, some other sector that comes in that's not regulated by that policy. And finally, we start to talk about that before the lunch. You can have leakage between supply chains. The European market has a very strong standards on the production, and then all that food or product moves to the Chinese market because you don't have the same standards. So it's a leakage between supply chains. And so I think it's quite interesting to see that over the years, we've really broadened the way we study and understand leakage across these different components. Let me just give you one example from our research with Patrick and a PhD student, Isaline Jardin, that was on Costa Rica. Costa Rica is a beautiful example of a forest transition. If you look at the forest data, you see so this is forest fraction of the country under forest cover. These are the years. So deforestation, then you have this very, very sharp forest transition where suddenly you start reversing completely the trend. And one of the, among many, land use process that led to that transition is the replacement of the extensive cattle ranching by a much more intensive agriculture. including banana, pineapple, oil palms, some really high yielding, high value export crops. So it's kind of land sparing effect. But then suddenly something completely unexpected. You develop your production of pineapple, you have to export them, you have to export your bananas, and for that what do you do? Well, you need wood pallets to transport all your pineapples on a ship. And then suddenly there's a huge demand for wood pallets. And where do you get your wood? Well, you have your plantations on that land that you spared by intensifying your agriculture. So now you have a leakage from agriculture to forestry, and this production of wood pellet is consuming all your plantations. So that spillover is really important to understand in terms of nature conservation, because basically it's cancelling the benefit of your intensification by something, and who could have been anticipating that? You know, just is the kind of thing that we try to capture with these studies on spillovers. Supply chain interventions, as I mentioned, they also have their form of leakage. Now, initially, the kind of naive theory about supply chain intervention was coming from this graph from the World Wildlife Fund, or this Jason Clay group in the WWF, that say, well, with this massive amount of consumers, with all these smallholder producers in the world, really hard to intervene, but due to globalization with these really, really highly concentrated supply chains, some of these commodities, most of these commodities transit through 3, 4, 5 companies, you know, for bananas, soy, cacao, really a small number of traders or processors. And these are transnational companies. So if you intervene at this level, then of course you will transform completely the production across countries, because they are transnational. So if some companies adopt a standard, then you won't have leakage anymore, because they are buying their soy, their palm oil across the world, so there's no potential for leakage. So that's why we should go for supply chain interventions. And of course, many companies have made commitments on zero deforestation and many other things. We just finished a study. We took a random sample of companies on the stock market in OECD countries. We analyzed their sustainable sourcing policies. About half of them had adopted some form of sustainable sourcing companies, and a third of them with a third-party auditing of their companies. So something of their practice, so something quite credible, quite massive. But that's a bit naive, of course. And a group of us had a workshop a few months ago, or maybe a year ago now, where we're thinking about, you know, how these supply chain intervention work, are they effective? And then we realized, when we analyzed these different commitments by companies on their sourcing practices, we really find 4 different bodies. One, we find the collective aspirations. These companies that get clustered, they go in a big group, and say, okay, together we commit to end deforestation. That's the New York Declaration on Forest. That's the Consumer Goods Forum, 400 retailers that say by 2020 we'll stop deforestation in our supply chain. Collective aspiration. Second, we find some individual companies that make these pledges, which are really aspiration. Okay, we aspire, we commit also to remove deforestation from our supply chain. And these are general. These apply across the whole sourcing countries. But then you find these implementation actions. Some, not all of these companies say, okay, we made that pledge, now we'll list a series of concrete actions in order to meet our aspiration. And we'll manage that. And finally, some go even beyond and say, and in order to implement these commitments, we'll adopt some standards that are either designed by NGOs, eco-certification, Rainforest Alliance, Fair Trade, whatever, or we'll adopt some kind of sectoral standards, will be part of a roundtable, that will be our standard. And that's how we categorize these 4 categories, these 4 types, or whether it's about setting a big goal, an aspiration, or whether it's really about identifying concrete action for the implementation, and whether this is done at the company level or whether it's a multi-stakeholder group that makes this commitment. So we can identify that. Let's take an example of Cargill. Cargill signed the New York Declaration on Forests, no more deforestation in the supply chain by 2020 or 2030. That's the collective aspiration. In addition, they have their pledge, which is written in their policy on forests that applies to all their commodities, all places where they source from. And then they also have the implementation action, forest protection action plan. So that's where the concrete measures are spelled out. And even in many cases, they've relied on existing standards in order to implement that. But that's where the problem is. While the first two, it's global scale, all tropical forest, then as you move down the list here, then it really becomes very specific to one commodity and one region. And then now suddenly what do you have? You have leakage. Cargill has a very strict policy maybe on soy from the Amazon, Brazilian Amazon, because they signed to the soy moratorium, but then they go and get their soy from the Chaco, Paraguay, Argentina, etc. And so even though, naively, initially we thought this supply chain intervention will eradicate the issue of leakage, not at all actually, it just maybe amplifies it because you have this very stringent policy in just one commodity, one region. Okay, I've been listening to my chair of this session and he wanted to think about causal mechanism. So let's talk about that. I think there's quite a lot of literature that's been starting to think, okay, what is causing this leakage? And we find this concept of activity versus market leakage and land market versus commodity market leakage. And Patrick organized a few months ago a great workshop where he assembled a group of us and he asked us to think about the theories of land change. And Rachel and I were in a group where we were kind of chairing a discussion on leakage and spillover. And so, you know, from Rachel, Patrick, and some of us, we kind of produced a graph that summarized some of these pathways leading to leakage. First, you start with some policy that restricts a land use X in one place, place A. And if it's effective, it's not always effective, but if it works, then of course the production costs increase. There's a transaction cost, you have to be audited, there's verification. You know, land is off limit, they're not accessible, so land price increase, and some producers lose access to land. So first pathway of leakage, these people, the same people, move out, migrate out of that region, they take their machines, their capital with them, and that's what we call activity leakage. The actual actors move with the material. And that's mostly if they had no alternative locally, no off-farm opportunities, they could not really intensify. And if labor and capital is very mobile, very easy to move, not the same country, no restriction on migration, and there's plenty of land available elsewhere, so that's what we call activity leakage. And when I say we, the literature, you, you who wrote these papers. Another one, that's Peter, I guess, talks about the land market leakage. So what happens here is that as land is off limit, you know, you restrict land, so land price increase, and if the land market is integrated, then maybe, you know, that sends a signal to some other regions that are integrated that same land market. Well, no, land price increase, so let's invest in this other land elsewhere, mostly as a speculation or anticipation of future land use pressure, responding to the land increase in place A. And that's what Peter mostly has been calling the land market leakage. Then the more kind of traditional economic view is that, of course, that intervention will lead to a decrease in the production of X, therefore an increase in price, and then some other producers elsewhere will just produce more of that good because now the price has increased. It's just a response, the market response, and that's known as the commodity market leakage. And that mostly occurs where there's demand is inelastic to price, and when there is land availability, they can easily convert land to that crop. But of course, they have two alternatives. If demand is elastic to price, then you may well have just a reduction in consumption. You just have an absorption on the demand side of that shock here, of that policy shock. Or most likely, that's probably what will happen in most cases, you will simply have intensification. And since Bosch rep, that land scarcity does incentivize farmers to intensify, especially when you've reached your land limit, you have inputs, you have the technologies. And finally, the intervention may not be a public command and control intervention. It may be a supply chain intervention, a moratorium, a standard, a zero deforestation commitment, and in which case, if there's very low incentive for the farm, they are not really rewarded for complying to this standard. If there's a low stickiness of the supply chain, they are not really connected to that supply chain, they can easily move their stuff to another market, then there will be a supply chain leakage. These producers will either sell their good X to another market, or they will just shift to another product, Y that's not really regulated as much. And here we'll have a supply chain leakage. So here we have 4 categories of leakage with some mechanism behind that are, of course, they overlap. We can argue for long, I think that there's some interaction, they reinforce each other, that's very clear. But with all these conditions here that associate with whether we rather have one type of leakage versus the other, if I summarize them, it's largely related to land availability and accessibility in terms of land tenure and indigenous tribe using that land, etc. It's about labor and capital mobility, level of market integration, potential and cost of intensification, demand elasticity, of course, and transportation cost, because of course if you leak your production elsewhere, you still have to bring back that production to the market, and in some cases transportation costs will kind of slow that down. If we now turn to the evidence, I didn't start a full literature review on this, but I think on the very first one I was mentioning, the local area leakage around protected areas, etc. There's mixed evidence. When you read the literature, some papers say, oh yes, we really find that as you regulate, actors move just outside the logging concession or the protected areas. But I've read also a lot of papers that say, no, we didn't find any local leakage. It just seems people intensify or the market adjusts, but there's little local area leakage. But by contrast, there's very strong evidence for cross-country, and I don't even want to call it leakage here. It's just cross-country displacement of production. And I said I don't want to call it leakage because when you talk about cross-country adjustment, how do you know it's really related to the change in policy rather than these macroeconomic factors that Tom mentioned this morning? And in general, and I will show a couple of studies, this land use displacement tends to increase the land use efficiency, at least in terms of area, not always in terms of ecological impact. And let me show you what I mean here. Tom Kastner, who's not here, but he seems to be on every talk, has a slide with the work from Thomas Kastner, but he has one of his paper here in ERL. So he has this kind of global trade in terms of cropland area embodied in trade. And first, what he noticed that the dominant trade flows is from high yield to low yield regions, which right away suggests that as you trade more, then you save some area because you go from areas with high yield to low yields. And actually, he had this model here, 2008, and he had a counterfactual with no trade. Let's remove trade. Every country has to produce, sell, what he used to trade, and then he computed that you need 84 million hectares additional to what we have already just to meet the same production. So in that sense, trade is, of course, helping us to be more efficient in terms of number of hectares being occupied. But wait, of course, but if you put these hectares in Brazil and in the tropical forests in Indonesia, then of course in terms of ecological cost, there's no saving at all. You know, you save hectares, but you don't save biodiversity, you don't save carbon, because you displace your production in biodiversity-rich and carbon-dense ecosystems. But not always. Just to give another example, a completely different scale, so that was global. Let's look at a national scale study, again with Patrick and Isaline Jardin. Bhutan, you know, we studied Bhutan because we thought, okay, if there's one country in the world who's not displacing its land use, it's Bhutan. You know, this small kingdom, really isolated up there in the Himalaya, very close border. And true, you know, look, wood production, wood consumption in Bhutan, you know, really almost the same year after year, poof, until 2006. And 2006, suddenly you have a decoupling between wood production and wood consumption in Bhutan. They start to consume really more and more wood, and the production of wood in Bhutan decreases. Well, there's only one way to do that, is by importing more wood, in that case from India, and which we qualified, and we have, now that's the displacement, the import of wood, mostly in the form of charcoal actually from India, so the displacement of land use from Bhutan to India. But in that case, all that charcoal is coming from state-managed tree plantations, which have been plantations for centuries or certainly decades in India, rather than from the super biodiversity-rich forest of Bhutan. And I would rather see this charcoal produced in these tree plantations than in the beautiful valleys of Bhutan. So again, that's a case where the leakage or the land use displacement or the trade, however you call it, has been net positive in terms of ecology, so in terms of carbon and in terms of biodiversity. Finally, you know, when we talk about spillover, we also attach a kind of negative connotation to it. You know, you export your deforestation, you export your ecological footprint. But then if you look at all these systems, there's a lot of positive spillovers. There's a lot of diffusion of new norms and values about sustainable consumption. There's a lot of institutional isomorphism, to use some jargon, that are some institutions, some policies are being reproduced from one place to the other, you know, when they work. When companies adopt this sustainable sourcing practice, it's a one way to distribute these standards across their supply chain. And that's kind of vertical diffusion. And when companies sign these collective agreements for zero deforestation or something else, it's also more horizontal distribution, diffusion of some standards and norms. So we should also look at these positive aspects of spillover. We don't just export our deforestation, we also export the good things we try to do, or values. Okay, summary, just on time. So I think what I've said first, we have adopted and need to continue to adopt this broader view of leakage, not just between local places, but also between actors, sectors, supply chains. We need to look at leakage in terms of territorial intervention, zoning, but also in terms of the supply chain intervention. You also find this leakage. And we need to think about this positive aspect of spillovers. You know, we need to look at the push and pull factors. And when we do a good job at integrating the pull factors of leakage, then suddenly it's not leakage anymore. It's really trade, it's macroeconomic change that leads to a change, a restructuring of the global economy. And we have theories about that. You know, we have trade theories, we have location theories, and why do we need to reinvent a leakage theory when we can actually embed it into these broader ancient theories? And finally, I think with these graphs I've shown from Patrick's workshop, I think we start to have a good handle of what are the mechanisms behind leakage, what are the conditions that in theory may be associated with one form of leakage versus another one, but we still, I think, need more systematic empirical testing of all these conditions, just to get this better understanding. Under what condition we'll have this type of leakage or no leakage or these other patterns. Okay, that's what I want to say. Thank you.